Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Peter Falus, and today I'm going to talk to you about how sailing developed from the simplest raft to the most modern electrically served sailing ships that today are plying the seas. One of the earliest way men sailed were rafts. Rafts sail with a simple square sail or any kind of canvas, but they have one limitation, and that's that they only sail downwind. Some rafts sail a long distance. Thor Heyerdahl's raft sailed across the Pacific Ocean. The next big development was reed boats. Reed boats are made out of reeds that grow on the side of rivers, and they distinctively collect the front end and the rear end, the bows and the stern into a pointed system, and the reeds take several months until they get soaked with water. In the meantime, they can transport loads, and as this couple of reed boats shows, they can have a bipod mast and a sail. These reed boats were 4,000 or 5,000 years in use, and in some parts of the Nile and in Mesopotamia, they're still in use. The oldest wooden boat that we know is an Egyptian burial vessel. This particular boat does not have a mast and sail, only oars. But you can see that its rear end still continues the tradition of reed boats. The stern and the bow of the boat, the front and rear end of the boat are pointed up, even though it's wood, like an old reed boat. By 3,400 years ago, King Hatshepsut of Egypt had enough money from farming and growing corn to go and send a fleet of ships down along the African coast, the Red Sea and the African coast, to pick up some elephant trunks and gold. We think that these mines were probably in present-day Zimbabwe. Of course, they did not have very good maps, but you could see that there is a very elaborate square rig with a yard and a lower yard and enough lines to shorten or extend the sails. The boat is, of course, wood with a stiffening cable on the top and double rudders. Another culture of sailing developed on the South Seas. Peoples from the Malaysian peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago 3,500 years ago started spreading over the South Sea. The interesting thing was that they basically spread against the prevailing wind, which means that every time they came out to look out for an island, more or less against the wind, in their very effective triangular sails and double canoes made out of large tree trunks, they could sail home easily and assured a way to return from when they came from. Here is a traveling double canoe transporting a small village of perhaps 40-50 people, some hairless dogs which they ate, and water that they have transported in hollow bamboo tubes. Some of these double canoes went as far as Easter Island, 4,000 or 5,000 miles into the wind by step. Of course, not in one voyage, but several of them. Along the coast, they developed the proa. The proa is a symmetrical vessel, which means that it can go to the left or right. There is no stern or bow. Both ends are symmetrical, and by leaning the mast either to the right or to the left and moving the triangular sails lower end, they would be able to sail into the wind. One of the first boats that could considerably sail into the wind was the South Sea proa. The third large development, independent from any other development, was that of the Chinese mainland and the China Sea. The Chinese junks, almost 5,000 years ago, developed into almost what they were about a century ago. Almost no development except for some very, very minor, a very shallow draft, flat bottom vessel, a very efficient sail that we would nowadays call a log sail, that is a combination of a fore and aft sail and a square sail, with the big improvement that every 3 or 4 feet there is a horizontal bamboo rod that makes the sail stiff, makes the cabling and standing rigging much less necessary and very, very easy to reduce, reef or furl the sail. These Chinese sails by the 15th century developed to such an extent that they were all over the Indian Ocean and the China Sea. Right up to about 1430, they carried most of the trade in the Indian Ocean using the monsoon system that goes 6 months from the southwest and another 6 months to the northeast, so that a sailboat with relatively little ability to go to the windward could sail one way east in the Indian Ocean in 6 months and then return the other way in the next 6 months. The problem was that from the middle of the 15th century, the dynasty that survived the previous one, that was a seafaring one, was completely inward looking, and the Chinese stopped sailing. They developed such an inward looking economy that all these large ships were forbidden to sail. Some of the last ships, this is a model of one of their largest ships, were almost 250 feet long. They even reached to the Australian peninsula, and they actually transported Marco Polo in the 13th century back from the court of the Great Khan right into the Strait of Hormuz. Our own history, that is Western and Middle Eastern history, starts with a very, very simple double-ended sail, double rudders, and a very simple square sail, a yard that is suspended from a single mast. One of the earliest ships that have been excavated is the Kyrene ship, which is in southern Greece. It was a late Phoenician, early Greek ship, and it's very typical of ancient merchantman. You can see that it has a double rudder and it has a simple mast. The sail is pulled up by buntlines, which enables the crew to simply pull up the sail to the yard as almost like a simple curtain. There are from fencing to make sure that the deck cargo doesn't roll off, and this kind of ship would sail across the wind and maybe just a little bit into the wind to claw off from a lee shore. Here is what it feels like to sail under an ancient ship behind a fully pulling square sail. The mast is supported by shrouds, and the sail is raised by a halyard, and there are several reinforcing strips, each one with holes in it, so that the sail can be raised and reefed into a smaller part. Of course, warships could not rely on the wind, especially in the Mediterranean, when most of the summer winds are light and variable. They did have sails, normally a mainsail and a small sloping foresail called the Artemon, but a warship relied mostly on oars. In the Mediterranean Sea, these oars remained much longer than anywhere else in the world, because until engines were developed in the early 19th century, the winds were so reliable that warships could not depend on it. Take a look at the stern of the ship. It still reflects basically the old reed boats heritage. By the 4th century before Christ, Rome started rising, slowly developing and conquering one Italian state after the others. The last were the Etruscans, and from the Etruscans that were seamen, they inherited the seagoing ability that they developed like the true engineers they were. Here is a Roman merchantman. A Roman merchantman was about 150 to 170 foot long. It would have a mainsail, it would have a small raffi or topsail, and it had the typical ancient artemon foresail on a sloping bowsprit. They were basically carrying grain from the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, that was Egypt. Egypt had much more grain that they could eat, and they sold it to Rome, who manufactured goods and needed the grain to feed the million people that Rome had when on its maximum expansion. Take a look at the double rudders, one on each side, and the well-developed rigging and the reinforced sails. Here is a drawing of a typical Roman merchantman, and here you can see that they were actually deep draft vessels. They could, here is the double rudder and the topsail, the mainsail and the artemon, and the cabin in which paying passengers were living. This ship not only went in the Mediterranean, but they actually went all around the French coast as far as England, which for about 400 years, 340 years, was part of the Roman Empire. Of course, the classis Romanorum, the Roman naval vessels, still carried the oars, and as they had no gunpowder, they simply relied on a bronze ram in which they attacked enemy ships. Of course, they have the mainsail and the artemon, and the sail was reinforced with leather strips, because the actual material was not really strong enough until about the 17th century. After the fall of Rome, there has been a great separation of trade. There was complete lack of order. The European continent was full of warring tribes. Trade almost completely got eliminated between the north and south, and the north, that was not conquered by Rome, developed their own type of sailing. Some part of the old Roman tradition in northern Gaul and Britain remained, but as the Saxons and the Angles conquered them, the northern type of sailing prevailed. Here is a very simple Scandinavian boat. You can see that the planks are overlapping each other. There is only a single effective rudder on the right hand side called the steerboard. This is where our modern starboard comes from. This particular picture is taken from the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, where the only actual archaeological dig revealed that the Vikings or the Norsemen actually touched the American continent. Here is a Viking or Norse trading ship called the Knorr. The Knorr was like a Viking ship in basic design, but it had higher sides and it was shorter. This particular boat actually sailed across from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to Newfoundland, where I basically found it on my trip to the archaeological diggings. Of course, their European conquering warships were quite different. They were the longboats. These longboats carried a very efficient mast and sail. The yard is lying on the bottom of the boat, and of course for actual fighting they relied on oars. Here is a North ship using a following wind and actually coasting down probably a North European shore. The boats were extremely well built, very flexible, and although they constantly leaked because of their movement, they were designed to do that, and as long as you build on them, they've lasted 40 or 50 years, being built out of the best oak that they could find. After the North was Christianized, that is, Christianity came to the North, new ship developed from the Viking ship. The Viking ship was basically a fighting ship. Their tradesmen, the Knorrs, were relatively small open boats. In order to carry the much increased trade that spread to the north with Christianity, the North German cities developed a kind of a league. It was called the Hansa. The Hansa developed a new ship called the Kog. The Kog was much higher, much bigger, much better defended than the Viking ship, and they were able to circum the pirates, which is what the Viking ships basically were to ordinary trading. If you take a look at the Kog, this one is a reconstruction of a ship that found in construction in Bremenhaven, and it actually sunk in clay, and almost the whole ship was excavated in the 1970s. You can see that the ship is a little bit like a Viking ship, except it has a modern rudder in the stern. No more double rudder like in the south, and no more side rudder like for the Vikings. It has a straight bow with extending into a bowsprit, an effective single sail. They're right now letting the sail down, and a fighting castle in the back, which was necessary because piracy was still rampant. Instead of a Viking ship that could be rowed onto a beach on logs and rollers, the deep draft Kog needed harbors. These harbors were developed in these German riverside towns like Bremenhaven and Rotterdam and Amsterdam and Mainz and Kronstadt, all the northern towns, and they have formed such a strong association that basically they dominated the trade of the North Sea anytime from the 11th century almost to the 14th century. In the south, meantime, a new power rose up after the fall of Rome. By the 17th century, the conquest of the Arabs started. It started in the Red Sea, it spread into the eastern Mediterranean, and one of its strongest points was a new sail that they brought with them, the Latin. We call it Latin, but it should be called the Arab sail, because basically it was the Arabs that developed it and spread it. This is a small Arab dhow in the Red Sea with a following wind on the Latin sail. The only Christian empire that were still opposing the fast expanding Arabs with their Mohammedan religion were the Byzantines, or the East Romans. When Rome died in the 5th century on the west, the eastern part of Rome, the Byzantine Empire, survived right into 1450. One of the reasons they did survive was Greek fire. Greek fire was a very, very strong weapon before the gunpowder, and they were able to project Greek fire from a bronze tube with bellows and compressed air. With this, and with their close administration and good navy, they were able to hold back the Arabs on the eastern Mediterranean for almost 800 years. Here is what an actual dromon, the Byzantine warship, looked like. The previous picture, of course, is a hand-drawn manuscript, and it wanted to more or less describe how a saint defended himself with Greek fire. Here is what we know about a Byzantine dromon. They were basically two-masted, Latin-sailed galleys operated with oars, and on the bow of them there was the famous tube which spewed fire onto the enemy. Merchant seamen on the Mediterranean and on the Iberian Peninsula were basically still using the Roman hull, a round hull with double rudders on both sides. The only innovation was the new Arab Latin sail. The Latin sail allowed them to go a little bit closer to the wind, and the Venetians and the Genoese and the French from the town of Marseille were able to hold their own, at least on the northern half of the Mediterranean Sea, with the Byzantine holding the east end, and the entire Iberian Peninsula and the North African coast overrun by the Arabs. There was, in the 11th century, a crusading fervor in Europe. With the Christianization of the northern tribe, Europe finally united, and there was this strong sense for reconquering the Holy Land. They wanted to spread their religion, and they wanted gold. Especially the French and the Italians, with the Pope's encouragement, encountered in three big waves of crusading fervor, and of course it was the Italian cities of Venice, Genoa and Marseille on the French coast that put the ships together. They were ships like the previous picture. You can see a crusading ship loaded with large horses, 40, 50 of them in each, 2-3 stories, with large castles to defend themselves against pirates, and almost 200 warriors on each one of them. They ended on the coast of the Holy Land in a town called Jaffa, and from then they started their march on Jerusalem, and the last part of the 11th century they actually conquered Jerusalem and established a Christian state that survived for about 250 years. By the 14th century, the Turks that were the latest waves of the Mohammedans took over the Anatolian, present-day Turkish peninsula, and they were threatening Constantinople, as I said, the last outpost of Christianity. In 1448, 1452, they conquered, they overrun Constantinople in a 2-month siege, and they cut off the Silk Road into China. They cut off all the spices that came through Constantinople, and Europe, that were entirely dependent on these spices, had to combine their strength and look for other ways to go to the end of the world around the Malaysian peninsula to get the spices, to get silk, and to be able to go around the Arabs that completely held the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And they did that in a very strange way. From the north came the refined square rigs of the cogs. From the south came the Latin rig that was inherited from the Arabs. A deep hull with a fighting castle completed with the northern straight rudder, a new ocean-going ship. This is a caravel, a four-masted caravel, and they were the first truly ocean-going boats from about the middle of the 15th century. At that time, because of these lack of ability to use the Silk Road to China and to the eastern lands that grew the herbs that were required for the preservation of their meat, they finally were able to have a completely seagoing vessel. This is a small caravel, probably a Spanish one, using a mainsail, a foresail, and what is not visible on this photograph, a single lateen sail on the back. A completely seaworthy vessel that is able to cross oceans safely. Here is Columbus's little fleet of 3 vessels, a large now and 2 caravels that in 37 days crossed the Atlantic Ocean into the Caribbean. They had no idea that the American continent lay in their way. They actually were under the misapprehension that by sailing west they knew that the earth was round, they will be fetching up either on Japan or in China, and that's what they wanted. By this time they had a completely developed square rig. Here is a dual yard. The lifts are there. There is a crow's nest, and there is even the very beginnings of a topsail. There is also rope ladder called ratlines that people are able to ascend on the masts. And there was now 2 masts carrying a square sail and a small mast on the rear carrying a lateen sail. Blocks with steel shafts and lignum vitae rollers became common, reducing the effort of hoisting and operating the sails. By the early 17th century, the Spanish have developed galleons. Galleons were truly ocean-going vessels. By the 17th century, around 1604, there was a very steady traffic, not only between Spain and its possessions of South America and Mexico, where there was a considerable amount of silver and gold mining, but also the English and the French and the Dutch that started raiding what was then nominally Spanish properties on the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. The ships that were used for these were galleons. Galleons were larger ocean-going vessels. They were approaching 200 feet. They have already a well-developed topsail, and just on the top of the topsail of the very first topgallant or topgallant developed on the mainsail. They had a fighting top or a set of cabins built on the stern of the ship, and it served 2 purposes. Of course, defense was the first thing. You could mount some small cannons on the top, but also if the sails was furled and there was a very large storm, the after castle windage turned the boat into the wind, and that basically saved the vessel. Here is the Mayflower. The Mayflower, this is a reconstruction of a Mayflower done in the 70s. The Mayflower was constructed about 1610, and by 1620 it transported the Pilgrim Fathers into modern Massachusetts. The Mayflower was an English-built galleon, a small galleon, not a warship, but a galleon-built tradesman. You can see that there is a very low after castle, strictly something to fight pirates with, a fairly high freeboard, and a very simple, effective course and topsail, main course and main topsail, and a single lateen. On the bowsprit, there was also a spirit sail which could balance the boat if she wanted to sail into the wind, which it could do just a little bit. This time the sail and masts were improved. Instead of one mast holding all the yards, there were a lower mast and a topmast and even a small topgallant mast. These masts were relatively easy to send down in a very strong wind. At the joint where the main mast joined the topmast, there was what we call a top. A top was basically a platform, and that platform supported the shrouds for the upper mast. On the top of the upper mast there were the cross trees, and the cross trees again spread the shrouds for the topgallant mast. This was quite a development, and by the end of the 17th century almost all nations had the same development of square rigging. Here you can see the square rigging, the yards that support them, the sheets that hold them on one end, the tacks that were able to get them forward, and the bow lines that could be stretched to the bow so that the sheet stretched out to the windward enabled a square sail to sail somewhat into the wind like a modern ship. One interesting aspect of 17th, early 18th century ships was the beakhead. The beakhead had two reasons. The first was a traditional one. It's a kind of a remainder of ancient warships where beakheads were the remainders of the ancient rams that were used to ram another ship. They were strictly a remainder of that. They were also necessary because they served as a point where the crew could use them as toilets. They had a slatted bottom, and that was the safest, the healthiest place where the crew could use that platform as a toilet, and of course the onrushing seas would clean it up. Even nowadays we call a marine toilets a head. The second reason for it was the gummoning. The gummoning was a tying down of the bowsprit, which of course was now a very important part of the forward part of the rigging. Around the middle of the 17th century there developed two distinct types of sailing. For deep sea ocean sailing, using the following trade winds and monsoon winds and known winds that were always known to be behind you, were the square rig. Large ocean going ships like this Dutch East India Company ship used the lateen sail on the mizzenmast and the mainsail and mainmast and the foremast square sails. However, for coasting, where you needed to go up actually into the wind, they used what we call a fore and aft sail. A fore and aft sail is roughly like a door that's hinged on the mast, and you can put it on either side of the mast, and by pulling it close and by having a deep hull or various lee boards or other items, you could actually go 60-70 degrees into the wind. This a large ship couldn't do. All a large ship with square sail could do, or maybe 80 degrees into the wind, that is 10 degrees from right angles. Here is a 17th century fore and aft rig called a yacht or a yacht. A yacht in Dutch means a hunter. This one is a sprit sail yacht. It already has two jibs, and like I said, the sail is fastened to the mast, and there is a sprit boom which goes from the base of the mast to the top of the sail and spreads it out. It also has a lee board that could turn down into the water and create a surface which is necessary in order to go to the windward. Here is a Dutch painting showing a number of sailing craft using a very, very light wind. By the beginning of the 18th century, all the known routes of the world with the following winds, the trade winds and the westerlies, were known. If you started from England, you went down to the Azores, then you picked up the easterly trades, you went across to the Caribbean. At the Caribbean, you picked up the southwesterly winds and you went to New York. If you wanted to go back to Europe, you used the westerlies and southwesterlies and the Gulf Current just south of Newfoundland, and you could go and do the entire circuit without ever having to cut into the wind. The wind was always behind you, and these winds were known as the trade winds. Here is the Bounty of about the middle of the 18th century, which was developed to such a degree that by the middle of the century there was no problem to send this ship around the Horn to pick up some breadfruit from the slaves of the Caribbean. Here is the Bounty, a typical 18th century ship with the officers' quarters and the windows and the men usually lying in hammocks under the decks. The rigging was completely developed almost to the point where there was no improvement necessary. Instead of the lateen rig, there is now a very efficient gaff sail on the mizzenmast and jibs on the bow. The boat has a deep hull which enables it to count 70, maybe 60 degrees into the wind. Here is an 18th century frigate. Frigates were the eyes and ears of the 18th century navies, and they were the fastest, handiest ships. They could fight off any merchantman, and they could run away from the much heavier ship. In the background there is a big merchant ship. Frigates were, this is a Dutch frigate, and it actually carries a Swedish flag, but it's built in a Dutch fashion, has the sails in the bunt, which was just before he was ready to anchor, and you can see that even though it carries the old-fashioned Latin rig, he has a mizzen 2 topsails. He has now a set of gun ports so that he can defend himself, and a very low quarter deck. By the last quarter of the 18th century, the only large part of the seas that were not